Okay, it's probably about the time. First of all, welcome everybody. Thanks for joining. It's great to see so many people turning up. Um, just before we start the actual talk, let me do a little bit of housekeeping. Just so everyone knows, we'll be recording this. We'll be putting it on the YouTube playlist after, as we do with all the talks. If everyone could turn off their microphones and their cameras, that would be great. That ensures that we can sort of focus on the talk. And also in terms of questions, we leave those until the end and we will read them through the chat. Just makes it a bit more, makes it a bit easier and make sure we can focus. There's not beeping going on with all the chats coming through, so we're not interrupting the chat. The presentation, I should say. So yeah, well, first of all, welcome again to another Value and Energy Data webinar. The idea is to present how digitalization and data is helping to support the energy sector. I'm an AI consultant at the Energy Systems Catapult, and I've been running these for the last few years. Today, we're very happy to have Professor Thomas Morstan, who's joining us from the University of Oxford, and he's going to be talking about the grid storage and how it can affect balancing costs and carbon emissions. I'll do a quick bio, and then Thomas can get started. So Thomas is an associate professor in power systems with the Department of Engineering Science at the University of Oxford. He also leads the Power Systems Architecture Lab there. He's also an associate editor of the IEEE Transactions on Power Systems and the co-chair of the IEEE Power and Energy Society Task Force on Power Systems Operations and Control with Quantum Computing. So today he's going to talk a little bit about some of his research, which focuses in the area of power system digitalization and market design, especially how it links in with enablers of net zero transition. So thank you very much, Thomas, for the talk, and I'll let you to take over and share your screen.
All right, thanks very much for that nice introduction. I'll just see if I can share my screen and get my slides up. All right.
Yeah, I can see that.
You can see that fine. All right. Okay. All right, fantastic. Well, thanks everyone for joining. Yeah, so today I'm going to talk about grid storage in Great Britain, system-wide impacts of balancing costs and carbon emissions. All right, so a quick overview of the presentation. I thought I'd spend a little bit of time talking about my research group at Oxford to give a sense of our wider activities. Then I'm going to talk about our specific EPSRC project where we did the work that I'm going to be presenting, which was the Digest project. I'm going to start with a kind of brief introduction about grid storage within the government's Clean Power 2030 policy, and discuss some of the limitations with levelized cost of storage analysis. And then I'm going to talk about two main pieces of work. One was looking at battery aging aware optimal stacking of GB dynamic services, and then talk about the work that we did on cost and carbon impacts of storage in the GB balancing mechanism. And then I'll conclude. Right. So within Oxford's Engineering Science Department, I lead the Power System Architecture Lab. So the group's now about a year old. The kind of main research areas that we work on are local and national power system modeling, large-scale control of grid edge flexibility, net zero electricity market design, and then we also work on power grid AI and quantum computing. I thought I'd mention some of our other projects, which are a bit, broader than the work I'm going to be presenting. So we also separately do a lot of work on kind of AI and digitalization, particularly focused on extracting flexibility from grid edge devices, things like electric vehicles and heat pumps and so on. So we have a project with ARIA looking at safeguarded AI techniques for this, and then another EPSRC project that's starting soon looking at cloud-to-edge computing to enable this kind of multi-agent AI techniques that we use. And then on the kind of broader, like interdisciplinary side, we have a new program, which is at Oxford, which is looking at battery circular economies. So really looking at the specific opportunities from second life batteries coming out of electric vehicles. And then we do some work with a startup company called Ionate, which designs smart hybrid distribution transformers. And so we try and apply some of our control techniques to optimize their resources within the grid. All right. But the project I'm going to be talking about today is a little bit different from these. So this is more focused on this kind of system level sort of modeling and optimization and economics. So this was the DIGEST project, which was data-driven exploration of the carbon emissions impact of grid energy storage deployment and dispatch. So the overall aim of the project was to demonstrate the carbon emission savings possible by optimally locating and operating grid energy storage in Great Britain. The project was led by Professor David Howie here at Oxford, and then we also had a bunch of different collaborators at Imperial College London and Brunel University. And then we also have some external collaborators. So I have a collaborator, Dr. Jacopo Savelli at the University of Bocconi in Italy. And some of the work that I'm going to be presenting was also done by a master's student that I had, Frederick Schiel. Now, specifically within the project, the questions that I was focused on was looking at kind of market operation and modeling in the context of storage. So some of the key questions we looked at was, how can we model the detailed operation of grid storage within Great Britain's electricity markets? How important is grid storage location for its market operation? And whether Great Britain's markets are incentivizing storage operation, which reduces emissions. All right, so taking a step back, so the government has a kind of ambitious policy towards net zero carbon emissions. So for electricity, the most kind of immediate policy, right, of biggest impact is this Clean Power 2030 target. So the government wants to have clean sources producing 95% of GB electricity by 2030, with the caveat that this is for a kind of typical weather year. So this makes it slightly easier to achieve, but still a major system change. And one of the biggest kind of changes, right, is that wind and solar, specifically wind, are going to be a much larger share of overall energy generation in the power system. So, likely implications of this are that we're going to have more periods in the year with excess renewable supply. We're therefore going to have greater variation in prices because when we have excess supply, prices are going to be very low. But then we're also going to have times in the year where maybe there's very little renewable generation, and then we're relying on these kind of very costly gas peaker plants to still provide security of supply. Therefore, we're going to need a greater amount of flexibility services also to deal with the kind of variability of renewable generation. And we're probably going to have increased transmission congestion because, building transmission projects usually takes around 10 years. So it's hard to see that we're going to have a significant amount of extra transmission capacity, by 2030 relative to the amount of extra renewable capacity. So all of this is kind of motivation for having a lot of grid energy storage. And so in the clean power sort of policy, there is sort of targets that are quite aggressive for grid storage, specifically battery storage. So in 2023, there was about 4.5 gigawatts of battery storage. Probably it's now over 5 gigawatts. But by 2030, the government wants to have between 23 and 27 gigawatts. So this is obviously a massive expansion of the amount of battery storage. And then also, they want to approximately double the amount of long duration energy storage in the grid. In the kind of Clean Power 2030 policy, they discuss storage that's kind of 6 hours plus. So that's kind of, I would say, more like medium duration rather than long duration. But and at the moment, we have around kind of 3 gigawatts of pumped hydropower. So we want to approximately double this. But really, when you start to look at the roadmap to 2050, so DESNZ, Ofgem, and NESO have another document they've created, which is the Clean Flexibility Roadmap to 2050. And when you look out to 2050, then you start to see a lot of long duration storage coming on the grid. So you're increasing from, this kind of 25 to 39 gigawatts of battery storage. Also, you want to increase to something like 7 gigawatts of pumped hydropower and around 9.5 gigawatts of compressed or liquid air energy storage. But then there's also this massive amount of kind of 25 gigawatts of hydrogen to power. And if that's going to be, low carbon, then a significant amount of that would be kind of electricity to hydrogen back to electricity. So that's kind of a storage technology, but long duration. Okay, so There's a wide range of grid energy storage technologies that are available. Pumped hydropower is a fairly mature technology that's been used for a long time. Lithium-ion batteries are the kind of popular modern grid storage technology, and this is driven by their costs reducing by around 97% since 1990. So this means that they're actually viable for certain grid services already. But then we also have these newer emerging technologies that are all having a lot of research and kind of development focused on them. So we have things like redox flow batteries, compressed and liquid air storage, and then also hydrogen as well. Now, you can think of storage technologies as varying in a couple of different key parameters. So you'll have a cost per kilowatt, so your sort of power capacity cost, but then also a different cost per kilowatt hour, so your energy capacity cost. And then different technologies will have different efficiencies, and then they'll also have different cycle lives. So particularly with battery technologies, they tend to have a limited number of cycles before they've degraded and need to be replaced. And so depending on these different parameters, then the storage systems can do different things in the grid. Okay, so what can grid storage do in the grid? It turns out there's a bunch of different flexibility services that storage can offer. And the idea is that different technologies are sort of particularly suited for specific types of services. So for example, we have frequency regulation services where we need on a kind of second by second to balance supply and demand in the grid. So this requires very fast delivery of power, but then we also have slower timescale reserves to deal with longer periods of deficit supply. Also, we can think of energy arbitrage, so where a storage system is buying energy at a low price and then selling it later at a high price. We can think of that effectively as a kind of flexibility service. And then also there are services like constraint management, which are dealing with transmission congestion in the grid. Now, these flexibility services vary in a couple of key kind of parameters as well. So one is activation frequency. Some services are activated many times in a day. Other services might only be activated a few times in a year. There's the required ramp rate of the service. So, do you need to deliver your full power within 1 second or within 10 minutes? That makes a big difference to what type of technologies are relevant. Also, the duration that you need to discharge power for when you're activated. This is very relevant for storage technologies because it means you have to have that energy stored. And then also, depending on how often the sort of service is activated, then when the service is not being activated, you're going to have to recharge your system. So you can think of, okay, what is the price of energy going to be for recharging the battery so that it's ready to then provide flexibility services when next activated? Okay, so the standard way that people have previously thought about evaluating storage technologies is this idea of a levelized cost of storage. And so the idea is that you can take a particular storage technology with its different set of parameters and a particular flexibility service. And then you can say, okay, well, if I was going to dedicate that storage technology to just providing that flexibility service, what would the sort of lifetime average cost be per kilowatt hour of sort of service delivered? And then this gives you a kind of levelized cost for that service. And so then you can think about, okay, I can evaluate different technologies and see which one is the best for providing different types of services. So you usually get something like, okay, lithium-ion batteries are probably good for providing fast flexibility services because they have, relatively high efficiency and very high ramp rates. But then, something like pumped hydropower is going to be probably better for providing longer duration services because it's much lower cost to increase its energy capacity and so on. And then also these levelized cost of storage calculations can very easily be turned into a kind of net present value calculation as well. All right, so this is great, right? But are we kind of missing something in this type of analysis? So there's a couple of key assumptions that go into this levelized cost of storage. One is that we're assuming the storage technology is only providing a single service. Also, we're assuming that the prices associated with that service and the prices for recharging are fixed or will average out over the time that we're delivering the service. And then also, we're not accounting for the grid location at all of our storage system. And so this means that we're missing some complexities. So we're missing the opportunity to do flexibility service stacking. So there's the idea that, okay, rather than just dedicating your capacity to a single service, you could split your capacity into a range of different services. And this might be particularly desirable when you have storage technologies that have nonlinear characteristics, which mean that they can provide a certain amount of kind of fast, rarely used services, but a certain amount of slower but more oftenly procured services, and so on. Also, we're missing out on market price dynamics. So this is very relevant if you have a lot of storage systems, for example, all trying to provide the same service.
Yeah. Yeah. Hold on, just
So I'm getting
forwards.
some audio interference. Okay, great. All right, I'll keep going. Yeah, so this is relevant if you have like a lot of storage systems all trying to provide the same service, and that's going to drive the service price down. And then also this idea of network location and congestion. So there might be some services that can only be provided if you're in a particular point in the grid. And also there might be some services where if you're in a congested part of the grid, you won't be able to provide. And then the last area is carbon emissions impact. So when we're thinking about, when we're thinking about the sort of levelized cost of storage, we're just thinking of the storage system operating on an economic basis. But when we're trying to think about the carbon emissions impact of a storage technology, what we're actually interested in is what is the change in what other generators are doing in the system, given what the storage system is doing, right? And so that's difficult to evaluate if you don't have a kind of understanding of the wider grid. Okay, so the first I'm going to talk about is this kind of work we did on battery aging aware, optimal stacking of GB dynamic services. So the dynamic services in the UK were kind of set up by NESO to help them manage grid frequency. So they're all fast delivery services. There's 3 different services: dynamic containment, dynamic modulation, and dynamic regulation. And they all work in a similar way, but with slightly different delivery requirements. So dynamic containment is the kind of fastest one. You have to deliver it within 1 second, and you have to be able to sustain power delivery for 15 minutes. On the other hand, dynamic regulation is kind of slower. You have to deliver it within 10 seconds, and then it has to be sustained for up to 60 minutes. And each of these have a low and a high variant. So the kind of low frequency variant is then discharging the battery, whereas the high frequency variant occurs when there's kind of too much supply in the system and you're actually paid for charging your battery, right? Now, batteries are kind of well placed to deliver these services because they have very fast ramp rates. So you can sort of fully discharge, you can kind of move your battery up to providing its full power rating within around 100 milliseconds. And these services, because they have to be delivered quickly, there's a relatively smaller amount of technologies that can deliver them. And so this means that they tend to be sort of more valuable than maybe slower grid services. And the way they're procured is through something called the Enduring Auction Capability Platform. So this is a kind of co-optimized auction where we have day-ahead auctions with 6 4-hour blocks. And the idea is that if you win one of these auctions, then you're paid for your availability as a battery at a kind of pound per megawatt per hour sort of level. And then the idea is that you have to sort of monitor the local grid frequency. And then if the frequency deviates by a certain amount, you then have to provide a certain percentage of your sort of rated power that you've bid into the service. Okay. Now, what complicates the picture slightly when we're thinking about batteries delivering these frequency services is that their batteries have degradation that depends both on their sort of usage. So we have cycle aging, and then it also depends on just the time that the battery has been sitting around. So you also have this kind of calendar aging. And ideally, we need to take both things into account when we're thinking of sort of optimizing battery operation. In our study, we focused on lithium iron phosphate batteries. So these are kind of relatively low cost, have good safety and long cycle life compared to other lithium ion battery technologies. And so this is why they're kind of one of the preferred technologies for stationary batteries. The key point with degradation is that it has nonlinear dependence on the state of charge of our battery, so how full our battery is at a particular point in time. Also, the state of health of the battery, so its past degradation then informs future degradation. And then also its charging and discharging power as well. So if we're charging or discharging the battery more aggressively, we're going to have more degradation. All right. And then the other thing that we have to take into account is that there are some specific rules for stacking services when we're using what NESO calls energy limited assets, which is applicable for batteries. So we wanted to investigate specifically this kind of optimal stacking of these three different dynamic services, as well as wholesale energy trading. So the battery can recharge in the wholesale market, and it can also potentially sell energy in the wholesale market if the prices are very high. The limits on sort of energy limited assets state that, okay, your state of energy, so the amount of energy in your battery, has kind of limits which depend on the capacity that you've allocated to high and low services. Basically, if you have a high sort of allocation of services, then you have to keep more energy stored in your battery. And then the idea is that, okay, if a state of energy violation is detected, then at the next settlement period, you have to submit an order to correct this. So if you had too low energy, you would have to submit a kind of buy order to buy energy. And this order wouldn't take effect until after gate closure. So that would be kind of 1 hour later. But the idea is that, okay, this is why these limits are a little bit conservative. So they make sure that you're not going to kind of violate your energy limits. All right. So key findings from our analysis, we looked at a 5 megawatt, 5 megawatt hour battery operating under different strategies. So we looked at what the kind of impact of accounting for cycle aging was on its own, or only accounting for both cycle and calendar aging when doing this kind of battery optimization. What we found was that compared to a baseline where you're not accounting for aging, accounting for both cycle and calendar aging increases your profits by around 25%. And actually, even if you just account for cycle aging versus accounting for cycle aging and calendar aging further increases your profits by 6%. So calendar aging is a kind of type of aging that's often neglected from these kind of calculations, but we find that actually that also has a significant impact on your operating strategy. The idea is that when you include aging awareness into your battery optimization, then what this sort of pushes you towards is less aggressive optimization of your battery. So you build up profits more slowly, but you end up building them to a higher level before you have to replace your battery. And in particular, what they do is they change the optimal stack of services that you provide. So the idea is that it pushes you towards doing charging via dynamic high services. So you're bidding into frequency regulation products that would cause occasional charging of the battery at fast time scale. And then the idea is that when you're pushed to a high state of charge, you immediately try and discharge that energy in the wholesale market. And this results in more time spent at a lower state of charge level, which actually is then causing less degradation of your battery. All right. So, these dynamic services are kind of a high value. And so they've been desirable for storage systems to participate. But the problem in the UK is that the market scale is relatively limited. And so actually, there's only around 3 gigawatts of these dynamic services procured at any point in time. And GB already has around 5 gigawatts of grid batteries. So it's not necessarily that surprising that, since their peak in 2022, the prices for these dynamic services have fallen a lot. And so this motivates looking at slower grid flexibility services with larger market volumes. And so this was the motivation for us to look at the GB balancing mechanism. And with the balancing mechanism, we were interested in both the kind of cost impact of storage systems, but also how does that link with carbon impacts? Okay. So the GB balancing mechanism is an important market within the kind of range of electricity markets because it's the main market that NESO uses for both ensuring supply-demand balance in the system and also for managing transmission constraints. The idea is that for each half-hour settlement period, BM participants will submit final physical notifications, which are basically their anticipated imports or exports of power based on the trading that they've done in, intraday and day-ahead markets. But then they also submit offers and bids in the balancing mechanism. So offers are basically the price that they're willing to increase their supply or reduce demand if NESO needs that to help with balancing the system. And then similarly, the bids are kind of the price that they would be willing to reduce supply or increase demand. And then the idea is that NESO would select the kind of lowest cost collection of bids and offers, accounting for the location of the different units to ensure supply-demand balance and also deal with any network constraints. And the market size for this in 2024 to 2025 was around 2.7 billion pounds. The market is pay as bid, so participants are paid at the price that they bid at. And the volume is around 32 terawatt hours of balancing services, but that includes upward and downward volumes. Okay. Now, the balancing mechanism is kind of directly linked to transmission grid constraints. So we need a transmission system model for GB to be able to do this analysis. To do this, we took data from the electricity 10-year statement. So we have a sort of fully detailed network of the UK transmission grid, or the GB transmission grid. So we have around 2,000 nodes, which includes the 353 grid supply points that connect to distribution networks. And then we have around 3,000 lines. And so these are all of the transmission lines and grid nodes that are 33 kilovolts and above, basically, in the system. And then we also have data from Elexon for the balancing mechanism participation. So balancing mechanism participants are sort of mandatory for generators and loads that are over 50 megawatts in England and Wales, 30 megawatts in South Scotland, and 10 megawatts in North Scotland. But then there are also additional participants. So you can optionally participate in the balancing mechanism as long as you're aggregating 1 megawatt of kind of load or generation. And then the idea is that there's two types of units in the balancing mechanism. There are transmission connected units. So for these units, we know exactly where they are in the network. But then there are also embedded units, so units that are in distribution networks. And one of the issues with the kind of UK's data is that we only know the DNO region of these embedded units. So the UK is split into 14 DNO regions. So obviously each DNO region is going to have multiple grid supply points. But for understanding the transmission system impact, we need to know what grid supply points these embedded units are connected to. And so to do this, we looked at historical unit level and GSP level sort of metering data. And then the idea is you can set up an optimization problem to infer the most likely locations of these embedded units throughout the grid, basically. Okay. All right, so then once we have our kind of detailed grid model, then we want to look at, okay, understanding balancing mechanism decisions and how they would be impacted by grid storage. And to do this, we used counterfactual simulations. So basically, we simulate balancing mechanism decisions using optimal power flow. So we use a kind of DC linear model of the grid, but with additional voltage constraints added in, because it turns out that kind of managing voltage is an important component of the balancing mechanism. And we need to compare two different simulations. So one simulation is sort of a base case where we have the historical Elexon physical notification data and bid and offer data, and then we're just trying to replicate balancing mechanism operation. But then what we want to do is add a grid storage system somewhere in the network at a particular node. And then we want to replicate balancing mechanism operation, but with the added idea that NESO could optimally control this storage system to minimize balancing costs. And we assume that NESO has a kind of perfect foresight of future supply and demand when they're doing this kind of storage system optimization. And so the idea is that this is basically giving the kind of best case possible value that that storage system can offer the balancing mechanism. All right. So in terms of results, one thing that we looked at was the impact on balancing costs and carbon emissions in winter and summer. We used kind of representative months, so kind of January in winter and July in summer. We looked at 4 different technologies, so lithium-ion batteries, vanadium redox flow batteries, pumped hydropower, and hydrogen energy storage. And then we looked at, okay, what is the sort of cost and carbon impact if we had these storage systems at each of the different DNO regions, right? When we're looking at winter balancing costs, we found that, across pretty much all of the storage technologies, southern Scotland was the best region for storage overall. Location here has around sort of ×2 cost impact in winter. So lithium-ion batteries in the best possible region, southern Scotland, are going to reduce balancing costs. So we're looking at a kind of impact of a 1 megawatt 2-hour unit to kind of show a marginal change in storage. So this would have a kind of 1,600 pound lower cost if we had this kind of storage system in southern Scotland. If it was in northern England, which gives the lowest cost change, then it would reduce balancing costs by around 700 pounds, for example. And one thing you can see here is that the hydrogen energy storage impact is kind of very low across all the regions because, and this is driven by hydrogen energy storage having kind of very low efficiency round trip. And so it's not used very much, in the balancing mechanism compared to the other technologies. Okay. We also then looked at balancing costs in summer. In summer, interestingly, location has a much bigger cost impact. And actually in the north, you do get a significant amount of sort of operation even for hydrogen energy storage. Lithium-ion batteries here in the kind of best possible region would reduce costs by like 4,000 pounds, but in the worst possible region would only reduce them by around 380 pounds. So here you're having around a 10 times, sort of value difference between the best and sort of worst region for battery storage. All right, so then we can also look at the marginal emissions impact from this kind of 1 megawatt 2-hour unit when it's being used to sort of optimally reduce balancing costs, right? So what we found was that in winter, the carbon emissions impacts was kind of significant from location, whereas in summer, there's kind of a relatively small impact on emissions. In particular with batteries, depending on the region, they can either reduce sort of CO2 emissions by around 71 kilograms per hour or increase them by 230 kilograms per hour. So this is obviously like quite significant range, and you get similar results for pumped hydro as well. And it's kind of non-intuitive, right? Because you think, okay, well, storage is supposed to charge when we have excess renewables. How can it increase emissions? And it can actually increase emissions using at least 2 different mechanisms. So one way it can increase emissions is if it's storing emissions-intensive generation during low-price periods for then use later by flexible loads that otherwise may not have been run. And then also it can unlock flexible demand, which would be blocked by network constraints normally. So that's 2 different ways that storage can actually increase emissions kind of counterintuitively. In summer, the emissions impact of storage is kind of relatively negligible. And this is probably because, at the moment, okay, the UK doesn't quite have enough solar, right, for it to be being curtailed, basically, right? But if you had a lot more storage in the grid, then these results might be different. All right, and then finally, we also looked at the net present value that you could have in the balancing mechanism from a sort of 100 megawatt 2-hour system of each of the different technologies. Here, we're kind of looking at this kind of NPV value at the different possible DNO regions and also at current CapEx costs, as well as if we had a 30% decrease in CapEx or a 70% decrease in CapEx, for example, because of technology changes. We included capacity market participation as well, which storage systems could do while also participating in the balancing mechanism. And because sometimes the storage system's full capacity, right, is not going to be used in the balancing mechanism, we assume that any spare capacity is used for stacking dynamic containment. What we find is that all of the storage technologies struggle to have positive NPV with existing capex costs when they're primarily participating in the balancing mechanism. But we found that lithium-ion batteries and pumped storage could have a positive NPV in the balancing mechanism if they had a capex reduction of sort of 30%. But hydrogen storage remains sort of NPV negative even for a 70% capex reduction. So this kind of implies that, okay, for balancing mechanism participation, probably hydrogen storage is going to struggle, and so it probably needs alternative market mechanisms to really be investable. All right, so in conclusion, levelized cost of storage is a good starting point, but neglects important aspects of how storage operates in the grid. For the work on aging-aware battery frequency regulation, kind of two key takeaways are that aging awareness can increase profits by 25%, and also that aging awareness changes the flexibility services that are best to stack. And then for the work on grid storage in the balancing mechanism, we found that storage location has a significant difference to balancing costs as well as emissions impact. And in many locations where storage reduces balancing costs, it actually causes emissions to increase. And so this is a motivation for either stronger carbon pricing or new kind of emissions-aware balancing mechanism dispatch procedures. And then also, we found that with moderate cost reductions, lithium-ion batteries and pumped hydropower could potentially be primarily supported through balancing mechanism participation. But particularly the vanadium redox flow batteries and the hydrogen storage would need like significant kind of breakthroughs to be able to be supported in the balancing mechanism. All right, thanks very much.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Thomas. That was excellent. I've got a few questions, and I ask everyone to put their questions in the chat. I see someone already has, but I'm going to ask maybe a couple first, if that's okay. One question is around the balancing costs themselves. How do you model those in the system? And I guess the other question related to that is, would those costs change obviously as you move to renewables? There will be changes in the wholesale, which is a big driver of the balancing markets, and things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. So actually the really nice thing about the balancing mechanism is that it probably has the kind of most available data, right, of any of the kind of market mechanisms in the UK. So what you basically have is you have from Elexon, you have the final physical notification of all of the sort of units. So what they would do in the absence of NESO running the balancing mechanism. And also what you have is the bids and offers that those units have placed in the balancing mechanism, both the ones that were accepted as well as the ones that were not accepted. And so this means that, for each of these kind of bids and offers, they have a kind of price associated with a sort of change in supplier demand wherever that unit is. And because the market is pay as bid, that if you accept, that bid or that offer, then that's exactly that change that you're having to the overall cost. So basically then what you can sort of say is, okay, well, if you can run a kind of optimization, which is replicating what the balancing mechanism is doing in terms of selecting which bids and offers to accept and reject, then you can sort of see, okay, well, the stack of bids and offers that are accepted gives a kind of total cost. And so the idea is that, okay, you have kind of two you have a counterfactual, which is, given the bids and offers, what do you accept to manage congestion and supply demand balancing? Either, as is or with an additional storage system added to the grid, basically, yeah. And then, but yeah, in terms of thinking about the historical, kind of, so that allows you to kind of in granular detail figure out what kind of would have happened or could have happened, in historical data. Looking forward is a lot more difficult because there is a complex interplay then between if you're trying to figure out, well, what would future units bid in the balancing mechanism, then it's kind of impacted by what their prices look like for long-term contracting. Also for wind generation, their bids in the balancing mechanism are very linked to the terms and conditions of their contracts for difference and so on. Because, for example, they might be willing to turn down, but only because, if they're being paid the subsidy value that they're losing and stuff like that. So looking forward is much more complicated, but from historical data, it's a kind of good market to look at. Yeah.
Right. Great. I was going to ask a question, but actually there's quite a few in the chat, so I'll go through those first. Jamie asks, have you assessed high-density hydro, such as RHE Energize, as part of pumped hydro? This technology could be much more applicable to hillsides rather than the limited mountainsides in the UK.
Yeah, so our analysis of the kind of definitely the analysis of the storage system technologies in the kind of balancing mechanism work is kind of, I would say very high level in terms of how the storage systems are modeled. We're basically just thinking about, okay, this sort of power capacity cost, energy capacity cost, efficiency, and that kind of thing, and sort of degradation. But we're not looking at the kind of details of like different versions of pumped hydropower or different chemistries of lithium-ion batteries in the kind of balancing mechanism work. When we're sort of saying, okay, well, pumped hydropower in this DNO region, we're not in the balancing mechanism cost, it's kind of fine because you're just saying, well, if there happened to be a pumped hydropower that you could build there. But obviously in reality, okay, it's all very well for us to say, well, this is the best region. But, probably, you wouldn't be able to actually place a pumped hydropower exactly where you want and so on. But the point is that this type of analysis could then be used if you were comparing two very detailed facilities against one another. That would be like a different use of our model, I guess. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you. Donovan asks, actually, thanks you, but also asks for what your key publications are. So maybe you can pop those in the chat later. Hrishikesh asks, from your research, it seems that batteries are the best solutions for the balancing market. What is your perspective on HES's role in long duration energy storage in view of the rising share of variable renewable energy in electricity market?
Yeah, so I think, definitely I think that, the sort of analysis is showing, right, that, okay, the mature technologies, right, which are really sort of, pumped hydropower and now kind of battery storage, because you've had such a long period of, technology development, and then you've now had these kind of economies of scale and stuff. You can kind of see that, okay, that, batteries are sort of out competing these other storage technologies, right? And that's where, and so you're sort of seeing, I think, even when, with this kind of new cap and floor kind of, 8-hour long duration storage contracts, that are being offered, actually, it turns out that probably at the moment, it's easiest still for maybe batteries to participate in that compared to maybe more like dedicated long duration storage technologies, which are at an earlier stage of development. I guess what it's kind of showing, I think, though, is that the balancing mechanism is kind of in between. The batteries are best suited for these kind of very fast dynamic services. They're kind of very much not suited for long duration balancing in the system. But for the balancing mechanism, okay, with this kind of shows with a certain amount of further development, you could imagine them starting to replace the kind of gas that's primarily used for the balancing mechanism at the moment. In terms of long duration storage, I think this is where there's kind of a need for fundamental kind of, rethinking of the sort of market design in GB and in kind of wider other countries, because really, for the Clean Power 2030 target, the system that we're kind of moving towards is one where we have a ton of renewables, a ton of battery storage, but we still have, sort of pretty much the exact same gigawatts of gas generation on the system. It's just they're only going to be used 5% of the time, right? And that's going to be a very costly system probably in the short term, because we're going to have to be paying those gas generators either in the capacity market or through very volatile, high prices during periods of low supply. So these kind of, so we may need new market mechanisms if we want to not have those kind of gas generators providing that, that specifically support long duration storage technologies. But that probably has to be a different market mechanism than the balancing mechanism.
On that, there was obviously a lot of talk about localized energy markets. Do you have any thoughts? I guess you haven't modeled it, but I guess any thoughts on how that would change your outcomes from this work if there was much more focused on, obviously there's going to be a disparate, distribution of generation and demand.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, separate to this work, right? My group is quite interested in kind of local flexibility markets and so on. We also did another piece of work that was looking at the kind of what a locational contracts for difference could look like for renewable generation technologies. So, for example, if you thought about having kind of accounting for network congestion impacts of different locations of renewable storage technologies, what would the kind of price difference be for CFDs? And you get something like a kind of plus or minus, 15%. So it has quite a significant impact, right, on that. I think the broader kind of point is that the way the UK's markets are kind of designed at the moment, you have, this sort of energy trading ahead of operation where location is basically neglected. And then in the balancing mechanism, you're paying for both upward and downward flexibility to partially deal with network constraints, right? And so I think the issue, right, is that you're basically having a kind of large cost on top of the kind of energy cost to deal with the network constraints, which is kind of being paid as extra, and rather than having incentives for people to locate units where it would be where there's kind of capacity available, sort of thing. So yeah, that's a kind of what I would say is a sort of a like a high cost approach, particularly as we move towards a system that increasingly has renewable supply concentrated in regions of high renewable potential, but not necessarily convenient from a transmission grid perspective. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Igo asks about whether you could expand a bit more on the two mechanisms you mentioned that drive carbon emissions up. So I guess that's the constraint and the sort of arbitrage, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So the kind of interesting thing, right, that wasn't obvious to us when we before we did the analysis of the balancing mechanism is actually the significant amount of kind of flexible demand that's kind of in the balancing mechanism. So the point is that there's kind of flexible demand that's available, and that flexible demand is kind of often not serviced. So the thing is that the storage is kind of having a cost useful role in the system by allowing kind of flexible demand to come on at to come onto the system at a price that it's happy to pay. But overall, then that's actually leading to a kind of increase in the utilization of sort of fossil fuel emitting assets. I mean, more broadly, I think the kind of one of the issues is that in the system where we have in terms of the onshore renewable resource, it's probably still usually below the demand that we're seeing in the system. And that sort of means that, okay, what the storage system is doing on the margin tends to be kind of moving between carbon emitting kind of assets. And then maybe, okay, there might be excess renewables that are being curtailed, but they might be in locations where the storage can't really do that much about the curtailment anyway, kind of thing. So that's a kind of a broader issue with the kind of structure of the system and so on, right? There's a certain amount that storage can do to reduce congestion, but there's kind of only so much it can do, I guess, as well. Yeah.
Did you look at the reduction in curtailment in these studies and how much sort of these battery storage or these storage devices in general helped reduce that?
So yeah, that's actually not what's it called? Not sort of numbers that I have off the top of my head, but it was something actually when I was preparing these slides, I thought, okay, that would be a good thing to like include. So that's something which I can definitely follow up on actually, because it is in our like that change would be kind of in our analysis, but it's kind of underneath the layers of sort of cost and carbon. Yeah.
Oh, brilliant. We'll share slides after this anyway. So.
Yeah. But I guess in the regions, so in the winter kind of regions where you're seeing carbon emissions reduction, that would be because of lower curtailment, if that makes sense. Right?
Yeah.
Or the only other one would be if there's kind of increased utilization of dispatchable renewables, but like dispatchable low carbon sources. But most of the time, that's going to be basically because of reduced curtailment of wind. And I think that's also why you're seeing the carbon reductions occur mainly in winter rather than summer as well. Right?
Great, thank you. Carlos asked for what your criterion was to measure the impact of the battery allocation.
When he says battery allocation, maybe possibly clarify.
I guess the location you're talking about. How do you sort of?
Okay, right, yes. So there's one thing which is where we're placing a battery in the system, right? And so when we're doing that kind of analysis, what we were kind of looking at was, okay, for the DNO regions, we were sort of averaging out the impact of having the storage system at different nodes within that region, because, okay, on sometimes in a particular region in a very specific node, you get a kind of outsized impact because of some very specific kind of congestion constraint. So that's why we kind of did it on this DNO level, and we're kind of showing, okay, the kind of average impact of having it at a node in that DNO region. So you can do a much more fine-grained analysis, and you may find that within a certain DNO region, there's a specific node that's much more desirable than another node, right? Usually that's because there are some nodes that are like, have barely any like, import-export headroom kind of thing. And then the other place we did allocations was around the embedded units. And, I mentioned that, okay, there's this kind of issue of, okay, there are units in the balancing mechanism, but that are at the distribution network level. And also that's the way that we think about supplier demand. So suppliers basically have a kind of equivalent demand balancing unit for each of the DNO regions. And so we sort of looking at historical data had to find a way of kind of allocating the share of that demand across the different grid supply points for that region. Which the details of which we kind of explain in the paper how we did that, but it basically involves a kind of optimization over historical data kind of thing. So it's a bit of a kind of state estimation kind of problem. Yeah.
Great, thank you. John asked about, so PSH typically has duration longer than 2 hours, typically 8 to 10, but there's also schemes which are looking at greater than 24 hours. What do you think that will have on the impact of your NPV results?
Yeah, so it tends to be that in the balancing mechanism, because the balancing mechanism is kind of half hour by half hour, it sort of means that it preferences storage systems are going to have a better NPV basically if they have a shorter duration, because you're basically then able to take advantage of the same high price periods, but you're then just not, whereas if you have a longer duration, you get a little bit of the high price periods, but you also have to operate in lower price periods as well, kind of thing. So for the balancing mechanism in particular, it's kind of this 1 hour, 2 hour kind of durations are probably going to be optimal from an NPV perspective. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you. Andrew has a question which is probably related to one I was going to ask actually. So it's about the baseline for carbon intensity. How do you do that for the comparison? Are you using a different scenario? Or have you got some other benchmark?
So the nice thing is, we have so basically for all of the balancing mechanism units, right, which basically include, all of the generators, above, 50 megawatts, right, we have their technology type, and we have their planned operation without the balancing mechanism kind of thing, right, in their final physical notifications. So we can see basically, okay, given the balancing mechanism, simulated decisions, what their output would be, and then what, before and after kind of thing, right? So you can directly see then what the kind of emissions change is. Of course, you have to do this kind of multi-period simulation with the storage because, in some periods when the storage is charging, the generation is then higher than it would otherwise be, but then in periods where it's discharging, it's lower, and so on. Now, the key assumption, the key simplification is, okay, we know the unit technologies, but we have to associate that with a kind of emissions factors, something sort of like emissions amount per megawatt hour. And so we basically have to use a kind of, okay, this is the average kind of emissions for OCGT gas generators. This is the average emission for CCGT gas generators, and so on. Whereas ideally, you would be able to take into account the actual emissions data of the individual generators throughout the UK, but we don't have access to that data. And actually, recently it was pointed out to me that like a further complexity is sometimes you'll have a sort of CCGT, but that could operate sometimes in sort of OCGT mode or something, right? So then it would sort of look like it has a lower emissions than it actually does, and things like that. So there are some complexities on the emission side where ideally you would have detailed models of every generation plant. But yeah, that's kind of an area where generation data would be very valuable. Yeah.
Just a quick one on that then was there like a quick back of the envelope type conversation calculation you could have done at the start, which would have been close to what you thought the savings would have been from this, or do you think it's only really possible through this type of calculation to get anywhere near it?
That's an interesting question. I think I think in the balancing mechanism, it's tricky to do a kind of back of the envelope calculation because the kind of market is kind of pay as bid. However, I think you can do a simplified analysis on the supply demand balancing component of the balancing mechanism. So I think NESO has some sort of high level statistics around, okay, they have this sort of, they sort of have the kind of net imbalance price kind of for the balancing mechanism. And so probably from that, you could kind of infer, okay, what is the kind of value of, what would you say, like the kind of value of energy at that particular time. But the operation in the balancing mechanism, it's very linked to, like if you're thinking about a counterfactual, it is very linked to the kind of specific bids and offers that are available and the specific and how those bids and offers are distributed throughout the country. So I think it's kind of difficult. One thing, for example, in the end, I didn't show this kind of analysis, but we also did some validation of, okay, how good is our model at kind of replicating balancing mechanism cost, for example, right? And we tended to get sort of our model sort of predicts the balancing mechanism cost at any particular time period, probably with an accuracy of an error of around maybe 10%, like 5 or 10% kind of thing. But one change, for example, that we had early on was we had the kind of DC power, like optimal power flow, but we weren't accounting for voltage in the system. And actually we found that was causing us like some significant errors. And when we added voltage constraints in, then we actually found that the sort of, errors probably halved or something from our analysis. So things like that, where it wasn't even obvious to us that the balancing mechanism was doing a kind of voltage kind of component. But then actually when I was like chatting to NESO in their sort of control room, they were kind of mentioning, oh yeah, like we are actually kind of like thinking about voltage when we're kind of making these decisions and stuff like that. So it is quite interesting that that's a kind of component. There's other complexities that we don't include. Like, for example, I know that NESO will like take certain transmission lines in and out of service. So that's something which we don't consider, right? But there's a lot of, you could do a better model, right, of replicating the balancing mechanism if you had, more detailed data and like information about how they actually operated.
Brilliant, thank you. I think unfortunately we've got to come to time. It would be great to have lots more questions because this is a really interesting and complex area. But I just want to thank you very much for the talk. I think it's been really useful. I think we've had a lot of questions. Sorry I couldn't get to all of them. What I might do is maybe send them you if you want to send them any responses to those in our email later. We'll share the slides as well with everyone, and as I say, the recording will be there. And Thomas, it's hopefully okay for them to contact you if they have further questions.
Yeah, of course. Got my contact details here.
Out there.
Very, very pleased to hear from people.
That's great. So yeah, thank you very much. We're up to time now. So yeah, as I say, we'll share everything later. So great. Thank you, everyone.